Thank you. Stephen Kinnock.
Thank you very much indeed. I just wanted to go back to this issue of legitimacy and link it to what question could be on the ballot paper in a possible further referendum. Now, in the recent European Parliament elections, the Brexit Party won convincingly on the basis of an explicit commitment to a no-deal Brexit. So it's clear, and from other polling that you've mentioned, that support for a no-deal Brexit across the electorate is quite strong, is running quite high. Do you think that a second referendum that did not offer a no-deal option would be a legitimate democratic process?
Shall I go first?
Sure, please.
I'm not sure I want to tackle your question head on, but it will allow the other panellists to get their heads together. This is something that we considered in our report on the mechanics of a second referendum, and we basically, this is simple. We concluded that there were three options that might be put to the people in a referendum: remain, a deal, or no deal. And then we looked at, firstly, how viable it was to present those options, and secondly, how they might be combined pairwise or in threes. And we did express some concerns that the difficulty with leaving a no deal off the ballot paper was that some people would say that a legitimate option had been left out. That's an argument on one side. But I do think that there are arguments on the other side as well. And actually thinking about this today, I think those arguments are quite strong. And I think that when MPs are thinking about this question of, you're obviously thinking about the question of no deal a great deal at the moment. If you move on to thinking about a referendum, I think it is a really serious question for you to consider whether no deal should be on the ballot paper at a referendum. And I think that there are three things to consider in thinking about that alongside the legitimacy question, which rather bears on the other side. One is the question of clarity. So to go back to the point that I made earlier, the very firm recommendation from the Independent Commission on Referendums and the comment from David Davis about not asking people to vote for a blank piece of paper and leaving the politicians to fill in the details afterwards, which I think has been shown to be somewhat wise after the event of the 2016 referendum, given the difficulties we've had. What a no deal would mean on the other side of that event having happened, if you see no deal as an event, is very unclear. I think most people agree that we don't really know what kind of negotiating environment we would be in, how those negotiations would go, etc. So you have a clarity problem in explaining what the outcome actually means long term for the public. There's clearly a difficulty that many MPs, partly for those reasons, have a lot of concern about a no-deal outcome, and I think there is a question for MPs. I think if MPs put something, parliamentarians in general, of course, the Lords as well, if parliamentarians put an option on a ballot paper, it has to be an option that they think is a viable one to deliver on and that they are comfortable with, because anything you put on a ballot paper may be voted for, of course. And then the third consideration, which is a rather more techie one, which we might go into in future questions, is what it does to the question structure. Because I think, of course, there is one two-option ballot that you could have, which would be Remain versus no deal. And if a deal has disappeared completely from the landscape, I suppose that has to be considered viable. But if there's a deal in play and you're looking at putting together a three-option referendum between Remain, a deal, and no deal, it does begin to get quite complicated, and we might want to move on to that. I know it was mentioned briefly in the session with the Electoral Commission yesterday. There are various reasons why that is complicated and would be more contentious in Parliament, I think, and take longer to organise and be more difficult for the public as well.
Yeah, in theory, this makes the end of Mega answers quite eloquently indicated, is that arguably there are potentially two separate questions here. One is, should we have a three-option referendum or a multi-option referendum, and should no deal be on the ballot paper? If the new UK government were to come to the conclusion that there was no deal that it could negotiate with the European Union, then the obvious referendum to have would indeed be between no deal and remain, because those would apparently be the only policy options that were available before us. If, on the other hand, we do have a negotiated revision of the deal, then the question becomes, well, do we go for a multi-option referendum? And I fear the answer to Mr. Kinnock is that you'll be damned if you do and damned if you don't. If you do, then the Leave side will complain that you're splitting their resources because you're going to have two Leave campaigns that are arguing against each other, whereas all the resources of the Remain side are behind one source. But if you don't, those Leave voters who dislike the deal, and assuming that, and unless the new government can come up with a deal that's more popular with Leave voters than the current one, then some Leave voters will complain that actually we cannot just simply say that we should just get out. I fear there is no simple answer. I mean, for what it's worth, such polling has been done on this. Unsurprisingly, polls that ask whether there should be a referendum on deal versus no deal are a bit less popular than the idea of referendums on deal versus Remain, but that of course is because for Remain voters the referendum on deal versus no deal is no choice at all.
What about the implications for turnout? Because I guess it's legitimate to assume that a further referendum that had a substantially lower turnout than the 2016 referendum would be substantially less legitimate than the 2016 referendum. I'd be interested in your thoughts on the relationship between turnout and legitimacy in relative terms. It's probably also safe to assume that if no deal is not on the ballot paper, politicians such as Nigel Farage would lead a campaign to boycott further referendum. So there's a high chance that if no deal is not on the ballot paper, turnout could drop quite dramatically. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that in terms of the legitimacy question.
I mean, there is no doubt that when you look at polling on what people say they would do if they were faced with a choice between Remain and the current Prime Minister's deal, you do get a disproportional expression of don't knows amongst those people who are Leave voters. Stroke, I wouldn't vote, and yes, there is a risk that they do, because the option is not on the ballot paper, that they decide not to participate. And here you would just have to decide what you think would happen, whether or not you think in the end that's what they would do, or whether in the end of the day, at least given the chance at least to actually vote to leave, that impetus becomes more important. And I think it is a tough call. But I mean, equally, if you go for the 3-option referendum, you probably discover that no single option gets more than 50% of the vote, and you're relying on second preferences, and you'll then get an almighty argument about whether or not this is, legitimate or not. I mean, beyond that, I would say, again, sorry to pour cold water on a lot of these ideas, but, I am reminded of the fact that we had a referendum in 1975, and by 1983 we had an opposition party that was campaigning to get out of the European Union without a referendum. And that the extent to which even the referendum in 1975, which came up with a 2/3 majority, actually managed to resolve the issue, I'm not sure it did, and that's why we're still sitting here, still arguing about it 50 years down the track.
One final question then on Professor Russell made some very interesting points there about clarity and the lack of clarity around what no deal actually means. But of course there's actually a real lack of clarity about what a deal is as well, because all you would have is the withdrawal agreement and the outline of a political declaration on the future relationship, which is very far from being finalised and very unclear. So it would be another leap in the dark, really. Perhaps a little less dark than 2016, but definitely the lights are on dimmer switch.
Well, I think if you look at the 3 options, it's pretty clear. I mean, you can get into discussions about Remain and Reform, of course, but if you look at the 3 options, Remain is relatively clear.
Yeah.
The deal, there are some concerns about clarity, and no deal is the least clear of the options.
But there is a problem. I mean, I think there is no doubt that to meet Alan's ideal scenario, we would hold a referendum when not only had we negotiated the withdrawal treaty, but when we'd also negotiated the trade relationship. The problem is, of course, is that the sequencing rules of the European Union do not give us that option. So again, politics trumps the ability of us to deliver what we might otherwise regard as the ideal outcome.
But if we're looking at that legitimacy question through the prism of clarity, then the only referendum that really has clarity about what leave means is a referendum at the end of negotiating the long-term future relationship.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
that's actually a referendum on rejoining the European Union.
Exactly. But that's the problem. But that's not the referendum that anybody wants. We want to be able to have a referendum, and because at that point we will not be able to execute Remain because we'll be reapplied, right? So that's the problem. The politics and the structure of the negotiations make it impossible for us to deliver what we might manage to agree would be the ideal process so far as British domestic politics.